We started Culturally Speaking to indulge our curiosity about the way others live and a desire to inspire conversations about how we have far more in common than we realise.
Hey everyone, we're back with another episode on this season about being Asian. And I think so far we've gone through, let me redo that bit. And so far we've touched upon the different stages in life. So growing up, childhood, teenage years, about our education, about relationships. So I think quite naturally, this brings us to the next phase, which is aging, as well as, I guess, the last phase in life, death. So Neha, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts on how we view aging?
Yeah, thanks, Janice. So, as a broad brush statement, I'm just going to say age is so respected, right? Age and wisdom in elderly in our cultures. I think that is probably, one of the core foundations or tenets. Like, I remember even just being really young and growing up and just knowing you respect the elderly. They have come with so much wisdom and knowledge and experience, and so I was always in awe, and I always be like, oh, when I grow up, or when I'm old, and it's funny because as a child that seems like such a long way away, and it is still a significantly long way away for us, but I think my perception of what even is elderly now just shifted humongously from now being in my 30s, when somebody would be like, oh, I'm 60, that would feel, oh, okay, that's elderly. And I guess, what does your definition of elderly mean?
I agree that I think my definition shifted along with the world's. I think as a child, elderly to me automatically meant, the gray or white hair, old people, actual old people. And then as you become a teenager or a young woman, you start fearing the 30s, I think. It's the first thing that as women we all hear about, right? That you've got to have this checklist done before you turn 30, otherwise you're a failure, basically. And now that I'm also in my 30s, can't imagine anything more different actually to that perception. I'm loving being in my 30s. I think actually every decade can be great. So I think my perception around the aging process has definitely changed, especially being Asian. Appearance-wise, both you and I still get mistaken for being much younger, which I'm not sorry about.
May that live a long time. I'm here for it. Keep IDing me, please.
And I think when my parents retired, their perception was very much that they're now old. Whereas for me, I guess I see that as not necessarily that they're older, definitely, but I still remind them, you're in your 60s, that's not old.
That's so interesting. You used a word that I think is the cornerstone of it all, which is retirement. And the approach to retirement, the retirement age as well. I mean, let's talk about that and how that shifts perception, but also the perception of what it means to be retired. I think so in the UK, obviously the retirement age controversially has gone up. It's now 67, I believe, as the state pension age. And of course, people can choose to keep working. And many people do keep working if they feel inclined to, or at least maybe they don't continue with the same workload or in the same career, but maybe they shift. And it's not uncommon, right, to hear people working up to 67, even possibly beyond. But when I looked globally at the retirement ages, it confirmed what I think I probably suspected, which was it's a lot lower in other parts of the world.
Oh, okay.
So, and I looked at India, right, for an example. It's between 58 and 60. The government retirement age for civil service employees is 60. I mean, that's young, my parents have just hit that milestone, and I think, could they stop working? Yeah, of course they could, but do they need to? Like, is it mandatory that they need to stop working? Absolutely not. I mean, I always explain to them that they still got 2/3 of their life left to live.
Exactly.
If potentially not slightly more, that's a long time.
Yeah, and I feel like when we talk about defining the elderly, right? For me, it's the physical aspects of it. So how mobile are you? How healthy are you? That's one aspect. And there's a lot of people who age prematurely, I would say, because of poor lifestyle choices, or it could be hereditary. But then the other side of your mind, of where are you in terms of your mental age? And I think especially now with modern medicine and things like being in the information age and everything, I do think everyone's kind of very active and able in a sense until a much older age. So I also wanted to touch on how we treat the elderly. So I grew up in Hong Kong. There's not too many elderly people in my family, actually. Story for a different time, but the age gaps in my family are bizarre, so everyone's still quite young. I wouldn't say the elderly are treated super specially, but they are treated almost as a protected group of people.
Agreed.
So apart from what you mentioned, Neha, at the start, of this natural deference towards the elderly, there's a lot of government provided help for the elderly in Hong Kong. So with residential care, it includes like subsidized and non-subsidized places. There's care homes. And one thing I think to point out in Hong Kong is that traditionally, if you had family, the elderly would always just live with family unless they needed specific medical care. So for me, it was a big culture shock when I came to school here, and one of my teachers said they just went to visit either her mum or her husband's mum at the home. And I was a bit appalled. Like, there was nothing wrong with her. She's just old.
Old, yeah. Like, she
And I
couldn't
was
live
a bit,
alone.
yes, and I was a bit surprised that, oh, why wasn't she living with you? Because my late great-grandmother lived with us until she passed.
And that's very common, again, in the parts of the world we come from and in Asia at large and other parts of the world, to expect a multi-generational household. But I think that has shifted in my culture, and particularly amongst people that live in the UK. I don't know if it's shifted for people that have migrated away. Do you find that people that have left Hong Kong have different views now they've moved back, or is it still the assumption is that an elderly an elderly relative would still live with you?
I think that it's hard to draw a line, right, for that, because it very much depends on what parts of your culture you decided to keep, I guess. I do have friends in Hong Kong who literally told me verbatim, at the moment, I'm not ready to move to a different country from Hong Kong for the next generation, i.e., their children, and give up on the last generation.
Got you.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're staying because their elderly parents are still around. And I actually wanted to touch on one thing. You mentioned that the retirement age in the UK is higher, right, than other parts of the world. In Hong Kong, actually, facilities for elderly persons are targeted at those age 65 minimum. So if you are between 60 and 64, only if you really need it, then you can apply for it. But the minimum age is 65. And I remember my dad, when he passed that 60-year-old mark, he was so like telling everyone about it. Oh, now I can, take the bus, take any public transport for like $2, like Hong Kong dollars. So that's like 20p. And there's like all of these financial support systems that the government has put in place. So there's something that we call the fruit money, right, in Hong Kong. So it's old age allowance. It's a kind of social security allowance scheme.
Yeah.
And these are for people who are at least 70 years old. So by which point you get given a cash allowance on a monthly basis. So at the moment, it's something around like 150 quid per month
And I
that
guess
you just
that's
get.
similar to in the UK, for example, like the elderly when they get fuel allowance in the winter to help them with heating costs and things. And similar. I think there are similar social provisions for things like that.
And I wanted to bring up a few facts, right? So I did a bit of research on aging population as a topic, and apparently by 2050, 1 in 4 people in Asia and the Pacific will be over 60. That's appalling.
Yes.
Like, that's really shocking to me, actually. And
Can I ask why? Did you think that the aging population either wasn't as severe as that, or you didn't kind of quite quantify it in that way? Because we know that we've got an aging population problem, right? Whether it's the UK, whether it's Asia, did you just not think it was on that scale?
yeah, I don't think I thought it was quite a quarter
Did you
of the
believe that the population
population.
was a lot younger given the birth rates and etc. in some of
Mm.
the countries?
So I know birth rate is low in
Yeah.
Asia. It has been for a long time. It's picked up a little bit with all the COVID babies, right? But overall, the trend has been going down. I just assumed the middle chunk would be bigger, perhaps.
The working population.
Yes. Because I remember a few months ago, my dad was telling me the working population in Hong Kong has shrunk a lot.
Yes.
And of course, this is also because of, immigration, natural flow of people. But it's quite concerning, I think. I mean, on the one hand, it's great that people get to live longer, I think, right? Because it implies better medicine, better facilities, and especially with people retiring that late, I kind of feel like it's actually great that you get 20 more years after you retire to enjoy the fruit of your labor. But then, maybe we can touch on a little bit of the impact of an aging population. In case people didn't already know, this has a massive impact, right, on infrastructural costs, on what we need to do to safeguard, this particular part of the population. And I don't know, I don't like the idea that because we now have generally longer life expectancies, people make the assumption that that means they can work for longer. I don't think
Yeah.
people should need to work. I think if they wanted to work, that's fine. So when I was in Munich last month, we went to this really, really interesting bakery. It's a social enterprise. So I
Yes.
think it was started by this woman whose grandma was great at baking. So she created this space where loads of people's grandmas and granddads would like just come together every day and make their favorite bakes, sell the cakes. But then that place is for these grannies to hang out and chat together.
I love that. It's so wholesome.
Exactly. I feel like this is what we would set up if we were like in our 80s now, except it's not baking. It'll be something else.
Yeah, I think that what you've just said about people not needing to work, I guess to rephrase what I said earlier, maybe clarify, I agree. I don't feel that there should be a compulsion for people to work. And I think that's why in the UK it is such a controversial thing that the retirement age keeps or the man or the statutory requirement, the pension age is increasing and will continue to increase, right? Let's not delude ourselves. But I do believe that life doesn't necessarily just have to stop turning in your 60s. It doesn't mean that your mind and your body necessarily doesn't have more to contribute. And I love instances of that, social enterprise. I love older people who go back to uni. I think Japan do this so well, where people continue to learn. Like one of the most inspiring stories I've heard in our family friend circle is it was a granddad who was widowed, and he went back and got a PhD in his 80s.
I mean, I don't have the drive to do it now.
Exactly, but isn't that such a great example of how if your mind is still, you know, alert and sharp and you have a quest to want to learn,
Super
there is
sidebar.
avenues.
Super sidebar on this topic. So I saw a post yesterday about this elderly female penguin who was a widow.
That's quite
And
sad because
this is
penguins
in the
mate.
wild. Yes.
Apparently, though, apparently they don't mate for life. Apparently, it's a complete myth, complete sidebar. But somebody please clarify that for us that knows more about penguin mating rituals than us. But anyway, back to the
So
widowed penguin.
this is in the wild, yeah. So this was captured by a photographer who does, kind of long exposure captures. There's another younger male penguin who's a widower. And
Right.
over the year, I think, when the photographer, was tracking these two penguins, every night they meet up and they look at the lights together and comfort each other. And then they part ways when the sun comes up. Every night they just comfort each other. There's no hanky-panky, guys.
It's
They're
just
just providing
companionship.
company. Yes. And I thought that was so sweet.
Okay. I think
That
we
was
need
the
to find
biggest sidebar.
the video or like the image of this and share it with everyone. But
Okay.
you've touched on something there, right? It's community, it's companionship, and I think and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying that. I'm lucky fortunate that I grew up with grandparents, and my grandma the other day told me, I don't know why I'm laughing, because it's quite terrible, but she said, now she's 87, or she's about to turn 87. She said, all my friends are dying or dead. And she just said it like, and my grandma was like very funny, but she just like deadpanned it. And I was just like, you're just gonna have to get new models. Like, you're gonna have to go younger. She's like, yeah, like I have to keep talking to younger people because everyone my age keeps dying. And I was like, it's true, right? Like, you get to a certain point where there will be people around you who don't have the same experiences and memories. And I think that it can be quite isolating for the elderly. So these social enterprises, these penguins meeting up, these clubs, and I think again, I was talking about Japan and how they create spaces specifically for the elderly.
Didn't someone also create, or maybe it was a suggestion, but they merged an old people's home with a daycare center. So they found that these tiny baby toddlers are the perfect match.
Oh, sorry,
for
when
the
you said
old
daycare center, I thought you meant like a daycare center for elderly. No, you mean for children. You
Yeah.
mean babies and
Yes.
older. Yeah.
Because the elderly, obviously, they've got experience dealing with it, but it also gives them a sense of youth, a sense of purpose. And they found that these kids are generally naturally quite gentle around the old people, and they're the perfect match for each other.
Why not? Right.
So
Why
I
not?
think that's a great, great idea. And yeah, I agree this community thing is super important. And as I don't think aging population as a problem is going away or slowing down. Someone will just have to come up with better ways, right? Of making sure even the elderly are living as, living as a normal part of the population, right, of society, rather than this cornered off group of people. And this is kind of like a good segue, I think, into this next topic. And we're going to try to do this without being too morbid about death. But for me, it is a very interesting topic because in knowing so many different friends from very different cultures, I'm learning that people view death quite differently around the world. So if I start with my own culture, and then maybe Neha, you can share your thoughts and what you know from your culture. So death is definitely seen as a very negative and sad and very somber event in life. As opposed to, as we know, some cultures celebrate death. They celebrate the person's life, and I can't quite compute that just because of how I was brought up. To me, that feels strange.
Have you ever
And
been
I
to a wake or a celebration of life?
yes, awake,
Yeah.
yes. But it's still serious, you know? There's no like dancing and singing. I've not been to one of those.
Oh,
And
they are very different.
mm,
Just yeah.
and I saw this video a while ago where there's an Irishman, you know, it was his funeral, they were lowering him into the ground, and he had arranged for a pre-recorded audio file to be played after he's been lowered. And you can hear him like knocking on something, saying like, "Hey, let me out. Why'd you lock me in there?" And I would be one, scared, two, shocked, if I had heard that. But everybody else was laughing. Oh, this is so him. Can't believe it.
Yeah.
And they were kind of alternating between crying and laughing. And that's something that's very, very alien to me. So in my family, I guess we're not very strict on any religion, but my granddad was Taoist. And generally in Chinese culture, our concept of a soul is completely different to that of the West. So there is no single immortal substance. It's not like, you know, you've got your body and a direct replica of yourself as your
Yeah.
soul, but there are two spirits, right? Because we believe in the duality of everything in the world. So there's yin and yang always.
Mm-hmm.
So the soul, which is the higher material that dominates the body, is different to what we call the po, which is the life energy.
Yeah.
Each person has 3 souls and 7 life energies. So
Question.
yeah,
Basic maths. Basic
yeah.
maths. How do the number of souls and the life energy compute to the 7, like the 3 and the 7? How does that square away?
So it doesn't. It's a different, I guess it's a different level of matter entirely.
Okay,
So
got you.
the soul is the essence of our vital energy, right? And it's a cosmic thing. Whereas the life energy um is a kind of a perceived thing, if that makes sense.
Is that the thing that I guess you and I can see, touch, recognize, like physically versus the soul, which is
Yeah, so the physical
intangible?
manifestation of the perceived soul is our body.
Okay.
So it's really difficult to grasp. But basically, the 3 souls are things like the original soul, which is responsible for your life, for your consciousness. There's the consciousness soul, which is responsible for your thoughts and emotions. And then the awareness soul, which is self-explanatory, responsible for your awareness. And then with your 7 energies, you've got things that are responsible for your will, your desires, your physical strength, your happiness, anger, your thoughts, etc. Right? So remember when I was saying to you that we talked about organ donation.
Yes.
And while I'm not a strict kind of Taoist or Buddhist person, I don't think I can do it.
You
It's
wouldn't
ingrained
donate
in me.
anything
No,
because
it's
you need to
ingrained.
be
I need to
whole.
be whole because
Okay.
I'll come to the afterlife in a minute, but unless I'm whole, I'm never gonna get to my next life. That's the
I do
problem.
remember you telling me this. So,
Yeah.
and for anyone who hasn't listened to it, we have an episode on the first season of the podcast where we actually talk quite in depth about funeral rites in our
Yeah.
respective cultures. And I do remember you telling me about organ donation because we had a question, and I said to you, "No, I'm a card carrying member of the organ donation club. Like, if anyone ever looks at my purse, you'll find it." Um, so yeah, it's interesting that you think you believe that you do need to be whole in the physical sense. And it's interesting what you said about the soul and the body, because we also believe in the soul, the atma, versus the physical manifestation of the body. And I guess the question I have for you is, do you believe that the soul and I'll call it the body for ease of explanation, do you believe the two are always connected?
No.
And okay, so yes, so that's we also believe that they're not always connected, because we believe one moves on and the body ceases to. It's kind of, once the soul has left the body for us, that that body is by the by almost.
So I'll briefly touch on kind of the concept of afterlife, because we've already talked about funeral procedures and stuff in that episode you mentioned. So it's a really rich and complicated tapestry is how I would describe our concept of an afterlife, because as with many things of the Chinese culture, it's been so many years. Some could have been made up by one person and just spread like wildfire. Some could have been rooted in Confucianism, whatever.
Yeah.
Generally, the belief is death is not the end. Right? Even though it's a very sad thing.
Yeah, it's not final, sorry.
Correct.
Yeah.
And there is a netherworld that you go to after you pass, but that's also not the final destination.
Is that the holding place almost?
Yeah, it's kind of like there is a hell actually in Taoist culture, and there are also, like Dante's Inferno, there are also different levels where you need to pass through all of them. And I think I told you this before, that as a child you just followed procedures and did whatever you were told or whatever you saw. And I began questioning some of these concepts as an adult, because we believe in burning things, right? For the dead.
Yes.
Now, the mourning period, or the duration that a soul needs to reincarnate, could be something up to like 100 days.
Okay.
Right? So if I'm now burning things, who's it going to? And if I keep burning money, does that not cause hyperinflation in this netherworld? Because it's all the same money.
I remember you saying you asked your dad that.
My dad just said, no, I have no answers. And I find actually the concept of, whether this is real or created, I guess we won't ever know until we pass ourselves. I find it very interesting that across so many cultures, we've basically mirrored the living person's world to the afterlife. Maybe it's more to bring comfort to the people still living, right?
I was
that
just about to ask that.
On.
Was that, how much of that do you think is to give us something, like, us here living on Earth, something to identify with, to visualize, to almost wrap our heads around?
I don't know. I actually do believe there are other levels in the world that we can't perceive. I don't necessarily believe in the version of heaven and hell painted in cathedrals, or described in the Bible, or even from Chinese culture. For me, because I didn't grow up with a single religion, I've always believed that the state that you pass with, so how at peace you are, indicates if you're going to heaven or hell. That to me is what that means to me. And certain things, like on the 10th level of hell, the last level, there's this lady called Meng Po, like this really old lady. Lots of legends and folklore around who she was before she died. But essentially she picks loads of flowers, plants, which apparently grow in the netherworld, and make this soup that helps you forget everything, including the pains of your material life.
Okay.
And you need to drink this, but I think some people say you can avoid it, which is why some people come into the new life with memories of a past life. But generally speaking, you're supposed to drink this soup, and walk across this bridge, and you go to your next life. That's how it's supposed to work. And I find these just very interesting. And I guess it takes away the fear, maybe, of death a little bit, knowing that you just go on a different adventure, essentially.
It's very interesting, because obviously there are things there that I would say I can relate to, or I understand what you're saying, particularly when I was questioning you about soul and body, and I was thinking, this isn't that hard for me to understand. So I'm a Hindu, and I can't really talk about it from a cultural perspective because I think this is rooted in religion as opposed to culture. And I've talked about it before on the podcast, but yes, I mean, obviously, the belief of reincarnation. So again, the idea that death isn't necessarily finite. You know, the idea the soul is ultimately what can be reborn, and that can take many physical forms. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a human form.
Yes.
And that's something that I know other people that might find that kind of odd or different to what they believe is, you know, how can me sitting here as a human come back as XYZ was, you know, a non-human form, but there is that idea. In terms of the afterlife.
What is that based on?
I was just about to come to that. So the idea of what you do in this life will govern what will happen to you in the next, or if there is a next, is one of the core tenets, really, because it's karma. And it's, if you kind of think of it, somebody once described it to me as a bank balance. You know, and people often think of good and bad, and, you know, I did this that was good and I did this that wasn't good. It's not one single action that will determine where that balance ends up, right, over the course of your life. But it's how you've lived that ultimately determines what may come to you next. And you'll often hear it in sayings, or, you know, things that people will use terms of it or phrase or expressions, and they'll say, oh, in my past life or in my next life. So it's very much part and parcel of even the way we think about kind of today. You know, people very much have it on their radar. I would say it's not a foreign concept.
Actually, usually in a negative sense. So there's like sayings where like, in my next life, I'd rather give birth to like a piece of pork than you. Like there are things like
yes,
that.
Exactly.
But it's very much in the day-to-day language in my culture as well.
Exactly. And so the fear of death being, you know, the absolute worst, I don't think is quite an accurate depiction of how we view this, you know, moving towards death. Because ultimately, if you believe that there is rebirth and that there is something else to come, as you said, it's not necessarily the absolute end of everything. You know, you believe that there is you will come back again, or your soul will come back again. And I think that does put a slightly different spin on it in terms of the view of, certainly my view of life and death, you know.
Do you think it puts a different lens on the sense of time for people?
I think the way I've often heard it expressed is actually suffering, joy and suffering, you know, and by that I mean the ability to end the suffering, because we do believe that the ultimate end goal is not to continue being reborn, is to achieve that enlightenment state. And it's, you know, if you're Buddhist, it'll probably sound very familiar to you in that sense. So the idea of ending the suffering, because you don't want to take a worldly form, you want to have alleviated all of that suffering and elevated yourself to a position whereby you aren't having to come back and be reborn. So that's where I think it shifts the perception. In terms of, you asked, does it shift the perception of living here today?
Yeah, because then in a sense time is it's infinite.
It is, but the way I think it also influences the living today is the idea that all that you have done is being counted and measured. And there is an accountability to what you have done in your life. It's not a binary decision of heaven or hell. There are, many levels and layers in which your reincarnation can take form, and it can come back to you. So I think it's gone. Sorry.
I have another question. If I was a horrible person,
yes,
let's say I was Hitler, and so I was a terrible person for sure, right? So the bank balance is probably mega red at this point. And I reincarnate into something like, I don't know, a dung beetle. I don't know what the grading
what the
systems
spectrum.
are, but
let's go with the dung beetle. I like it. Yes.
Insects are probably bad.
Mm-hmm.
What do I need to do, and how many lifetimes away am I back to being a human?
Exactly, great question. I used to ask this a lot as a child, because again, you talk about the realms, you talk about Dante's Inferno, you talk about the levels, right? And you're completely right that taking an animalistic or an insect form, it's much harder to do good deeds. It's much harder to have positive impacts on the world and people around you, right? To move out the realms. I've never received a concrete answer on how you go from dung beetle to enlightenment. But if anyone does know, please do share.
So
the aim is not
guys,
to be the dung beetle, though. Do not be the dung beetle. But the key in all of this is do not be the dung beetle.
Some parts of these, whether it's based on religion or culture, I can see it being more of an educational reason, right? Of basically how religion was back in the day before society existed, right? It's almost like a warning that if you do something bad is going to happen to you. So I think some of this could be, coming from that place of just trying to encourage everyone to be a good person.
Well, I was just about to say that, is if you we ask very literal questions, right? We ask, as you say, dung beetle to higher plane of living. How do I get there, right? What's the pathway? But the reality is, the moral, almost, if you like, is almost like I said, you don't want to get to that position.
Yes.
And I think I very much agree with you that these are all, whether you want to call them tools, explanations, frameworks, they are
parables.
Ways to encourage people to do, and I quote unquote, the right thing, whatever that may be and whatever that may look like. And I think that's hugely open to interpretation, but that's, I think, the concept that people take. And I don't think that's specific to being Asian at all. Whether that's your,
I agree,
definition, mine, or anyone else's, I think that's pretty universal. One thing that interested me, though, was you talked about communicating with people in the afterlife. And this is just not something that I have any concept of. And I love this idea of you being able to almost have a thread or a connection to them.
It's like sending something to someone's PO box, if I'm honest.
But you don't know if they've got it.
Exactly. So that's always been my point, because traditionally you don't always burn things for the deceased. It's usually after the funeral, right?
Okay.
And nowadays you can burn plasma TVs, iPhone 15, whatever, right? It's made of a special type of paper. There's also these sheets of paper. You've got gold as a denomination and silver, and there's a special way of folding them so they look like a gold nugget, and you can burn those as well. And typically the money is more for on their way to this netherworld. There might be evil, like spirits or like devils, making their lives difficult. So this is to bribe them. Just pay them off, right? So they can get on with their way. And the other things, with the paper built things, you can even burn them like servants, cars, burn them a house. And there's this almost this other, netherworld economy going on, because I asked the question of, why do they need money? Are they buying things if they're buying things, someone's selling things, so someone's still working after they've died. Right? To me, that's ridiculous. But then I think I told you why I don't fear moths. So in my culture, moths could be the spirits of someone in your family who's passed, just coming to say hi.
I love that because they love cashmere, and that would so be me. Sorry.
Don't come bite my cashmere, please.
That would literally so be me. Wait till I tell my family that. They'll love it.
And I remember actually when my granddad passed, like the funeral bit, as we covered in that episode, I found very spooky. I've always found Taoist funerals quite scary to attend. It's believed that within the first 7 days, the spirit of the deceased will go back to his or her family just to say a final farewell. And
Yes.
I remember within that week, there was a moth that came to our flat and stayed there for like the whole week and then left.
And that was him.
That's what I think.
Yeah. No,
yeah, because the rest of my family don't believe in any of these things, but I believe there are other things in the world that we don't understand and we might never know exist. And perhaps a more rational explanation would be that was me kind of very slowly letting go, finally.
Yeah.
It could be that. So I think I agree. I like that in my culture there are still ways of being connected. You've come to my place. The only picture of anyone I've got in my flat, which I realize may be odd, is my late granddad.
It's interesting. I didn't find that odd. I already remember. Like I saw it and I knew immediately why, because it's something that is quite common in my culture. So it was, yeah, I knew immediately why.
I mean, I've since added a couple of family photos to my collection because I'm getting people asking me, are you a sociopath? Like you have no signs of anyone in your flat. But especially in my culture, in my family, for someone who's passed, their birthdays and their death days are both still commemorated. So typically on my late granddad's birthday, if I was at home in Hong Kong, we would always have the incense stick, and my mum does that actually every day because that's her dad, right? And it's a way of, I guess, still connecting with him. And we would always say a few things like in the family group chat, oh, remember granddad used to do this.
Yeah.
Oh, like granddad would have been however many years old today. And I think it's a very personal thing as well. Like for me, because he passed when I was a teenager, it's not like I had a whole lifetime of knowing him. So it's probably going to be not as rich as his relationship with my mum or her siblings.
Of course. Yeah.
But I will still sometimes see his picture and be like, hey, granddad, how you doing? Like, I will talk to him because I don't know where he is. He might have reincarnated as my neighbor. I don't know.
But it's interesting. My grandma has like a saying, and over the years my mother's picked it up, and it basically translates as, in a previous life, we must have had a connection. And sometimes when you meet people and you can't explain what it is.
Yes.
And they use this expression, and I actually think it's just such a lovely way of thinking. Maybe people are in places that you wouldn't necessarily know to look for them, but they are somewhere. And I think on that lovely note, look for the moths, look for the people, but stay away from my cashmere.
Make sure you watch out for the next episode, which is going to be our finale for this season, where we talk about our relationship with food.
Subscribe, rate, and review on your favourite podcast platform, and follow us on Instagram at Culturally Speaking Podcast. You can also check out our website, culturallyspeaking.co.uk, for a transcript of this episode. Share your stories or your show ideas with us by sending us an email at theculturallyspeaking@gmail.com.